You know, back when I was in the academy, we would follow every toast with a song.
Ready to go?
Yep.
Okay. Hi, welcome to another episode of Where No Bubs Has Gone Before, a Star Trek The Next Generation... I'm sorry, let me start again. Hi, welcome to Where No Bubs Has Gone Before, a Star Trek The Next Generation podcast, hosted by myself, Jay Record, and my father, Jake Record. We're doing this for the benefit of my son, Ben, but because we know there's so many great Star Trek fans out there, we're putting all of these shows out for free out on YouTube. How are you doing tonight, Jake?
I'm good, Jay. It's good to be here right in New York.
Yeah, this is another live episode that we're able to do together. Not just on Zencast, we're able to do it face-to-face. How do you like New York so far, and how is your trip getting here? And
I came up from the northern Maryland area, north of Baltimore, on Amtrak. It was very nice. Everyone wore their mask and so on, since we're still in the midst of the pandemic. And Jay lives in the Washington Heights area of Manhattan, the very northern part of Manhattan, and things pretty normal here. People are out in the streets, and parents taking their children to the parks, and there's some summer schools going on, so forth. So it's just typical New York summer. It's nice.
I bring this up because we are having conversations now in the country about and it's kind of connected to this episode that we're reviewing tonight, Up the Long Ladder, which is season 2, episode 18. But as you know, right now here in America in 2021, different parts of the country are suffering heavily under the new coronavirus variant, which is called the Delta variant, primarily if they're unvaccinated. And I was just wondering if the atmosphere or the situation in North Carolina felt different down there than it does here in New York.
Just from what I've seen just in the neighborhood here, everyone seems to be, my guess is that this part of Manhattan, that the percent of vaccination is fairly high. Do you know at all?
Yeah, it's very, very high.
So that some people, everyone who goes into a store, there's still in a lot of the stores I see a door says mask required for entry.
Yeah.
And so that's something that is, if this is the rule in this part of Manhattan, I'm sure it's the rule throughout the city. So you see a lot of people, when they're outside, I would say that 30%, maybe a little bit less, 25% wear their mask even outside.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people don't. There's about maybe of the 80% that don't wear a mask, there might be 20% who actually have a mask in hand, or they'll have it, the ear strings, they'll have them up their arms so it'll be on their shoulder so they have easy access to it. Somebody will have some types that they'll wear below their neck so they can just flip up. So I just get the vibe in New York that, because they suffered through the biggest surge back in March of 2020, that they felt the effects. Most people don't want it to come back the way it did and so forth. So I get the sense that people are being responsible here. There's discussion about whether the CDC should upgrade the masking guidelines and go back to say, people should always wear masks when they're inside. And they're reluctant to do that right now. And when you ask me about North Carolina, I've been away for 4 days now, but last week my observation just going to the grocery store and the Target and places like that is that people are very relaxed in North Carolina now. There's, only, I'd say about 20% of people in the grocery stores or, like Target or Lowe's Home Improvement are wearing masks.
Mm-hmm.
All of the employees are still required to wear masks, but I was actually in the the one grocery store that's close to us, I noticed that not all the employees were now wearing masks.
The one I worked in high school.
Yeah, and I think that that's a little bit of concern because, you know, you don't know who's vaccinated, who's unvaccinated.
Is there a real worry in your part of North Carolina that you feel that you're around unvaccinated people?
Well, in Wake County, the county in which we live, the statistics say that it's 78%.
Okay.
It's very high in Durham, Wake County, which is Raleigh, Durham County, which is Durham, and Chapel Hill, or Orange County, which is Chapel Hill. There are now, you know, one red county in North Carolina and about 13 that are, you know, high transmissibility, if that's the right term. So, yeah, I think that there's sort of a responsible behavior being shown in New York, where North Carolina is like many parts of the country, perhaps if not most parts of the country. They say, it's down low, it's going away. I'm just gonna relax, and I don't think it's time to totally relax at this point.
Very well put. You know, I think one thing that a lot of people probably take for granted are the immediate impacts felt in certain areas of the country where COVID has hit the hardest. I imagine that LA has a very similar experience to New York's in terms of the amount of deaths that they accrued. I have to say, one thing that has become very disconcerting, even in New York, is that there is, I think, this attitude of, well, if we're open, we need to stay open, and we don't need to push for any more restrictions. But with people being unvaccinated or remaining unvaccinated, I know it may be an unpopular opinion, but in certain areas of the country, the unvaccinated may force certain things like that, not vaccine passports, but actually having to carry your vaccine card with you and show it to get into places like an airport or to get into restaurants. I can actually see people moving towards that. I don't think we're moving towards that here in New York because, for the most part, like you've noted, people are pretty responsible. But I do worry with the spread of the COVID outbreak, especially, you know, it seems to be hitting the majority of the unvaccinated. It doesn't seem like there. It seems like every time we get a report of a breakthrough case, I think I've probably heard of a dozen on the news, but it doesn't seem like there's really that many breakthrough cases. The vaccine seems to be working. Mm-hmm. Now, my question going forward, and then we'll get into the episode, and no one's really answered this. Where do we think we're going to be going in terms of a timetable as it pertains to vaccinating young children? And then the second question, obviously, is, okay, if the goal is to get everyone vaccinated, are we going to do that and wait for a booster? Or is the booster coming while we still try to catch up? My hope is that we'll have an answer on a booster probably sooner than later. When it comes to kids, that's going to be as it takes. But jumping into the episode, so we're reviewing, as I mentioned, Up the Long Ladder, Star Trek The Next Generation Season 2, Episode 18, which debuted on March 22nd, 1989. The star date is 42827.3. So, let's get into... This is a fun episode. I have to say, for a lot of the episodes we've seen this season and in the previous season, this is probably one of the more humor-centered episodes. There's a real tongue-in-cheekness throughout the narrative, but we'll get into those two.
I just have to say, you know, it's a fun, humorous episode where there's at one point Captain Picard actually laughs out loud.
Right. I think that this is one of the few... I think this is the first episode, you're right, where we actually see him laugh out loud. You're probably correct. So we open up on the bridge of the Enterprise D, where Worf is at his post at his tactical station when he suddenly feels uncomfortable. Fighting the odd sensation the best he can, he remains stoic as Captain Picard arrives on the bridge and summons Commander Riker to the ready room, where the captain relates a meeting he just had with Admiral Moore, where he plays for his first officer a series of sound pulses that began transmitting from a part of the galaxy 1 month ago. Riker is quick to discern that the sound is an antiquated distress signal or an SOS. Starbase had apparently Starfleet came to the same conclusion, and now the Enterprise is being sent to investigate a distress signal, which, when they look into it, seems to come from an organization in the 22nd century called the European Hegemony, which, looking at Memory Alpha, was one of the earliest progressions towards a united Earth. And we'll talk about united Earth a little bit, because I think I wanted to get into that as it pertains to Enterprise, because I think it's actually united Earth that is sending Starfleet into... sending the NX-01 into space, because there isn't a Federation yet at the beginning of Enterprise.
Right.
So, at this point, they're going to head to the fighter sector, but before we get off to really what is the main story, Worf faints right there on the bridge, and has to be taken to sickbay, where, we'll talk about this first. So, Worf goes to sickbay, and it's revealed that he basically has a version of the Klingon measles. And he is, of course, aghast by this because this is a childhood ailment, which is an interesting viewpoint. And I wanted to actually talk to you about this because you actually had the measles at one point where, children got it, which it seems to be a relatively rare thing today until a couple years ago when we got into the anti-vaccination movement, but we'll talk about that too. So Pulaski treats Worf, and Worf, embarrassed, asks Pulaski to keep his secret, which she does when Picard asks what happens to Worf, and Pulaski relates that Worf was taking part in a Klingon fasting ritual and forgot that while decreasing his caloric intake, he also has to decrease the level of physical activity he partakes in. Worf, thankful for this, brings what is only seen once, and I think this is the only episode where this is ever mentioned. Worf performs a Klingon tea ceremony, which kind of harkens back to a Japanese tea ceremony for Dr. Pulaski in thanks of her show of friendship and solidarity. And of course, they relate that he relates that Klingon love poetry is best spoken in the original Klingon, which is just like the line used by General Chang. In Star Trek The Undiscovered Country, Shakespeare is best read in the original Klingon as well. This is just, a fun little side story that really takes place in the first 10 minutes.
Yeah, and it's interesting because it just, how Dr. Pulaski, we're, 18 episodes in, and she kind of came across as kind of a cold, impersonal person in the beginning. But we've had enough little vignettes where she's really, showing her caring side, her passionate side, that she's even for the risk of the health of others, she's even the risk herself and so forth. And she does these little things to build strong relationships with members of the crew. And the Klingon tea ceremony is interesting because it's not a simple little, very benign, peaceful tea ceremony like in Japan. Actually, the tea that's used, if consumed by humans, is poisonous. And it's actually somewhat poisonous to Klingons, but it's part of their whole thing where they'll just have to suffer through it. So because of that, aspect that you're drinking to humans a deadly tea.
It's actually poison.
Yeah, you're drinking poison into... for Klingons, you're drinking a weak poison. It just makes the Klingon tea ceremony very different, of course.
I wanted to talk about the scene from the first perspective of Worf having measles. You were born in 1952. And how old were you when you got measles?
2. It was 1954.
So 1954. Before we had a common measles vaccine that every child gets now, measles seemed to be kind of a common illness that a lot of children got. Do you remember anything about having measles?
I was 2 years old, and I don't think most children have very
Right.
few memories, but I have some memory of being ill, having a fever, and being in the middle of a storm. And the story goes is that when I had the measles, Hurricane Hazel came through the Baltimore area, and we had a lot of wind and rain. I don't remember the specifics, but I know that the doctor we had, he was an immigrant from Hungary, a German Hungarian. He made house calls, and he came out to the house and I think gave me a shot. It may have been penicillin or something like that, just to prevent me from getting pneumonia. And measles, German measles, rubella, um, mumps, chickenpox, they were all childhood diseases that you were expected to get, and then you wouldn't get it again. You build up antibodies for it. But measles was particularly a serious disease because it could become the brain could be infected by them, as I recall, and the fevers could get very high, and you could get a secondary infection of pneumonia. So I don't know what the mortality rate was, but measles could be so debilitating it could cause affect vision, affect hearing. And it was really wonderful whenever the first measles vaccine came out, because it could be a very debilitating disease. And you don't hear, I don't know, I guess because of the anti-vax movement, you still have parents who don't want to vaccinate their children for what are the childhood diseases, measles, German measles, chickenpox, mumps, diphtheria, all those sort of things, which, can really be protective and made a big difference in reducing childhood infectious diseases.
Ooh, okay. So I found a statistic here about measles that although, okay, what was the? So in the United States, pneumonia was responsible for 60% of the measles mortality in infants.
Right.
But before vaccinations, between 3 to 4 million cases occurred each year. Now less than 600,000 cases occur because of vaccinations.
Right.
And many of the cases among the 600,000 are actually children who have yet to be vaccinated, so they catch it early within the hospital, or they are children of families who've decided not to be vaccinated.
Right.
Besides Worf's embarrassment about getting Rotnagor, what do you think it says about Klingons that they are able to catch childhood ailments at this point in the 24th century? Do you think it says something about their medical system versus Starfleet the Starfleet medical?
I wouldn't go that far. I think it's just part of the vignette, the basis for the story, for
Right.
the interchange between Worf and Dr. Pulaski. I think the interesting point I thought of when we started talking about this section of the episode is that, since I don't know how old Worf was when he was evacuated off Khitomer.
He was very young.
So he may have been young enough that he went into a non-Klingon environment, was
very
raised by
true.
Terrans, so that he may have not have been exposed to this virus.
That's very
So
true.
that may be the reason. Somehow he was exposed to it, and there may be other Klingons, on the ship, or who knows what the deal is there. But again, I mean,
he previously ran into Kalar. Kalar could have had it at one point.
So it could have been the reason that he's getting what's typically a pediatric Klingon disease as an adult. Could be that he was just never exposed to it. Possibly.
That's a very sharp observation. That is probably likely. Getting to the actual tea ceremony, I find it very interesting that the writers would place something like this kind of so suddenly into the very beginning of the episode, because in many ways, like if you look at the presentation of the actual tea tray and everything, it is clearly Japanese. There's this very beautiful flower, even though it has thorns on it. I find the idea of ingesting poison interesting, because we've had previous episodes where, for the Rite of Ascension, they use pain sticks.
Right.
So the idea of ingesting poison is not necessarily out of character for the Klingons.
Correct.
But it's also not out of character for certain cultures, especially in Asia. There are certain cultures in Asia, especially South and East Asia, where certain sects, especially among Buddhists, will ingest small amounts of poison and actually develop tolerances over time. There's a lot of stories just in crime fiction in general of like assassins or Batman or all these superheroes ingesting small amounts of poison to like raise their immunity. Scientifically, we don't know if you can actually do that, but it's a cultural thing that people try to do. So it may be that there is no actual health benefit, or even they may be just ingesting poison and people may be dying from this, but there is a cultural basis among humans for doing something like this. This isn't necessarily, something sci-fi-y.
Right, I understand. Good point.
And I think from an anthropological view that, I want to touch a moment on the Klingon, not necessarily, maybe perception, but fixation on pain and going through pain. And even Pulaski inoculates herself before she takes the tea, knowing that she is probably going to suffer some sort of symptom, but it's ultimately not going to kill her. What do you think it says about humans that we have a culture of, even here in the West, and we talked about recently people hanging themselves by piercings. What do you think it says about us as humans that we have this fixation or this kind of pleasure in seeking pain?
Good question. I don't have a good answer for that because I think that, when you talk about some of the basic Buddhist principles about life, just existence being suffering, they're talking about it from a spiritual, a mental, a physical aspect.
Right.
But, Buddhism, more, when you read about it, particularly from a Western perspective, you talk more about suffering, just because of life in general, which I guess does combine spiritual and material since they're so well connected and so on. And, we talked about the Native Americans having some ceremonies where piercing and voodoo has that, and some African tribes perhaps, and
Right.
so forth. And,
I believe that they're a Central African cultural group, but they have public circumcisions that we previously mentioned, which
Right.
they do with no anesthetic
right.
and basically with a knife, and that has to be a level of intense agony. But go on. I'm sorry, I interrupted.
Yeah, I think it just depends on, it seems to be, just from this brief discussion, that it's very much culturally defined.
I think
I think what you're asking is what's the basic human desire for pain?
Do you know what I think it might? Well, yes, and since you asked the question much better than I did, I'll take my shot at the answer and hear what you think. Based on, I think humans are always looking for some sort of novelty in their existence. I think there's a lot of things that we do that are just kind of constant to our day. We wake up, we eat, we go to sleep, we shit. We all have to pee. We all have to put on clothes. In some cases in the modern world, that constant goes to us having to go to work every day, us having to put up with certain things like the commute, taking out the trash, stuff like that. I think some people seek pain for the same reason they seek pleasure or adrenaline or excitement. They're looking for that instance that alters their state of perception or their state of insight. And I think there is, culturally, throughout the world, going back thousands of years, many rituals that use pain to alter your awareness. One thing that I've been reading about recently and watching a documentary on are ayahuasca ceremonies down in Central and South America. And a large part of the ayahuasca ceremony has a lot to do with purging, like actually purging your body of not only spiritual illnesses but also physical illnesses. One thing that you do during the ayahuasca ceremony to initiate the trip after you take the brew, they will, I think it may be before the brew or it may be after the brew. It might be after the brew. No, it's before the brew. There's this cleansing brew that they give you that's basically coffee and tobacco. Yeah, it's a horrible concoction, but you drink it and basically you vomit and shit everything out. You purge entirely. And then you don't eat anything and you take this brew, and most people are not initiated into the actual psychedelic trip until they regurgitate out the brew. So I think that there is this kind of strange physiological transformation that happens with or without drugs, that when we go through something painful, it alters our state of perception, and in that state of perception, I think some people find weirdly a measure of comfort or a measure of clarity in that. I think pain can be a great revealer in many ways too, and culturally speaking, in terms of America right now, we're going through a very we're going through an intense series of painful events in this country.
Yes, we are.
And part of that pain, I think, is being made aware of some of the things that we were probably negligent on. And I think that is part of the transformational or the process of what pain brings us to. Pain makes us aware of the things that we haven't been aware of. So, do you have any response to that, or?
No, as I said, I hadn't thought I need more time to really think through it. I think to give an answer to it, but it's interesting what you said.
Okay. Well, maybe we'll just jump on it on a later episode.
Sure.
So, the crux of this episode is basically another diversion. The Enterprise is going on about its business before Starfleet calls about this ancient SOS that sends them to the ficus sector. And, yeah, it's spelled ficus the way we would think ficus, like the tree. So these people, the Bringloidi, that we later find out are on this planet, they are from a European hegemony that was existent during 2123 to 2190, so it didn't last very long. They were on the ship, the SS Mariposa, which means butterfly. I don't know if this has a reference to the butterfly effect.
I don't think it does. I just thought of that.
Yeah. But essentially, the European hegemony of 2123 to 2190 was the precursor to a United Earth. And I want to talk about United Earth real quick because the show touches on it in Star Trek Enterprise. Because before there's a Federation, the Vulcans that we were working with during the Warp 5 project are working with the government that's organized under United Earth. So, in the late 90s, we have the eugenics wars, and then I think that leads into World War III, and then World War III basically destabilizes the world to the point where Zefram Cochrane one day fires up his nuclear missile and initiates... one thing that I wanted to bring up maybe on an episode, but I'll mention here... we never get a clear delineation between... And I don't know if you remember, and I was hoping maybe you could answer, but... in the USS Enterprise D, their warp drives run off of dilithium. Dilithium helps focus the antimatter mix. I don't remember... Is the NX-01 using dilithium in its engine? Or is that a nuclear fission engine? Because I think because Zefram Cochrane doesn't use dilithium, he doesn't have access to it.
We'll have to look that up. I don't remember dilithium being specifically mentioned or being a concern.
Yeah.
During the the Enterprise series with the NX-01. We'll have to check that out.
Yeah, but I was just sitting there thinking about that, like, okay, how are these people traveling?
Mm-hmm.
It seems very much like these ships that were sent out were part of a generational ship, but these Bring Loyalty are part of the new Transcendentalist movement. And for a lot of people that don't know, the Transcendentalist movement here on Earth in the United States and primarily Europe was a 18th and 19th century philosophical movement based along a lot of series of authors and painters and writers and a lot of creative people that, using a mixture of naturalism and some Eastern mysticism, kind of spoke to this idea of going back to nature to find yourself and to find the truth of how to best not only commune with the environment and the earth around you, but also find a sense of inner peace and belonging that many of these transcendentalists thought the modern world was moving us away from. The Bring Loyalty in this episode are so-called neo-transcendentalists, which take this idea that the modernization of the world is actually removing them from who they truly are, and they are moving out into space, essentially, to go and colonize a world where they are able to live in better harmony with their neo-transcendentalist ideas, which include, when Picard starts reading the manifest for the ship, includes cows, chickens, goats, all sorts of animals, to the point where Daniela Odell, who is the leader of the Bring Loyalty, says at one point when they have to evacuate the planet, that, Captain, what are we going to do without our animals? We can't leave our animals behind to die. What do you have any reflections on transcendentalism, and what do you think of this European hegemony and then the kind of, well, like the Bring Loyalty?
Well, I think the Bring Loyalty, you described, transcendentalism well, and it's
The Irish tinkerer Bring Loyalty, by the way.
yeah, and these people seem like after the World War III, and what happened is that probably a lot of industrial infrastructure was destroyed. So maybe these people had to go back and live a very agrarian life. I mean, they look like Irish people in the 18th or the 19th century, let's say. So they almost had to go back to live like in a former time. Although, they knew about space travel, they knew about warp drive. They had that level of education, understanding of the cosmos and physics and that sort of thing.
Right. These aren't uneducated people. They had to have gotten out there somehow.
And the one thing that you started to mention I wanted to respond to is about United Earth.
Oh yeah, right. Sorry.
It's interesting from a futuristic and a science fiction perspective that be brought up, because something we were talking about, when I was with you the other day, is that the problems that we face right now, particularly due to climate change, which is, causing degradation of the environment through huge forest fires in Siberia, in the American Northwest, in Canada. Right. There might be some in Europe now, and so forth. Sea level rise, reservoirs of water in semi-arid areas drying up, torrential rains in China.
Yes.
It's the effects of climate change are seen everywhere. So we talked before that what would be the effect, as Ronald Reagan said in a United Nations speech, of if we had an alien invasion, would all of our petty quarrels, something to that effect, just go away? And what humanity has to realize, we're really at that point.
Mm-hmm.
Particularly with climate change. The coronavirus pandemic should demonstrate that to everyone, that we're worried about suppressing the Delta variant surge in the United States, where most other countries in the world don't even have access to vaccines still.
Well, this is what's happening in Cuba right now. One of the main pressure points that's causing Cuba's uprisings right now is that they don't have access to vaccines.
So I think the whole point is you get to the point where you have such common global problems, people and governments just have to realize, we can't be at each other's throats for geopolitical reasons and business reasons. We have to come together and work as one species. And that might be scary to some people because it does have tinge of socialism where everyone has to work together. But that's how a population works in a niche. And in this case, the niche that human species is fulfilling covers most of the globe. Anyway, I think that one of the things, since Star Trek the series is American based, it comes out of American culture. What the United Federation of Planets represents is the next step from the United States of America, the uniqueness of what was founded back in 1776. We won't get into discussion how that union may again be falling apart in 2020 and 2021. But if you go on the basis that the United Federation of Planets is kind of based on similar concepts of union, that the U.S. Constitution or the concept of the United States...
I was about to say constitutional enfranchisement.
Right.
Because they do have a constitution in the future.
That's right, they do. So that if the Federation is, the next step in terms of a larger geographic, in this case galactic, union, then where do I want to go with this?
United Earth.
United Earth is a step from, what the U.S. concept represented in 1776 to
a global one
to then a United Federation of Planets then.
Well, I think in some ways we've always had organizations, especially here in the 20th and 21st century, that have been experimenting with this idea. You're correct in citing that America is unique in the fact that we really did start kind of the first global experiment in representative democracy in a way that had never been seen before.
Right.
And we can get into the actual foundations of the country and how faulty they might be in terms of what was done versus what was actually said. But I think one thing that we have to recognize is that the European Union was also an attempt in many ways to form a more democratic, more constitutionally based society.
Good point.
And one of the reasons that fell apart was, I think, I don't want to say dishonesty, because I think that there was this viewpoint that somehow you could have a profitable free marketplace, and that would be able to supersede people having common security interests or common cultural difference, or vast cultural differences. That somehow, if you made a vast a vast marketplace out of the European continent versus organizing into an army or organizing into a more actual Congress versus the ECC or the ECB. I think the reason that ultimately failed is the Europeans really don't have much of a constitution to speak of. That's why Brexit was so easy for the Europeans to kind of get out of. I mean, for the Brits to kind of get out of. But they also don't have, it's kind of important that the Federation has Starfleet because, and this is not me suddenly becoming pro-military, though I'm not anti-military, but having an organization, a government-backed, a government-sanctioned organization like Starfleet actually creates a sense of unity among all of the different member states of the Federation that Europe has not been able to do because Europe was not able to put together an actual standing force versus... here in the U.S., we had to put together a standing army.
You're speaking of the European Union in the past tense. It's not gone yet just because of Brexit. I mean, it's yet to be seen whether Brexit can actually end up strengthening the European Union if they address some of the internal bureaucratic issues that cause great concern for the Brits. But the one thing you bring up is that I think it's been a lot harder for European member states, former nations, to give up their national character.
Right.
And so on. So as you say, they don't have a common European army. If there's any common European army, it's under NATO.
Yes.
And in some ways, because of concerns about Russia, that's strengthening. But there's been talk of, and there's a small, if you could describe it, token European rapid response force, similar to what
Right.
the United States has. Now, the difference in America, is that one of the things we have, since we were originally 13 colonies and then we slowly spread across the Pacific Ocean, I think there was, as state constitutions and laws were created, Indiana law or Ohio law was not too different from the original Pennsylvania law.
True.
Because a lot of those territories were part of, Pennsylvania or Virginia that went all the way to the Mississippi River. So as we expanded west and new territories and states were created, and they created their separate, territory or state laws, they were pretty much based on what had already been established by the other states. Matter of fact, there is a commission on uniform state laws that exist. I'm not sure exactly how it works, but there is a group that meets, so they try to keep state laws consistent with one another. There's probably some constitutional issues involved because you don't, when you drive from across the George Washington Bridge from the state of New York to the state of New Jersey, the traffic laws are pretty much the same. There might be a little bit different. And if you drive into Pennsylvania, they're pretty much the same. So America developed in such a way where it has that uniformity, even though we live in different states and so forth, where the Europeans are really behind in developing that concept. And the other point is, once we gain independence, there's fits and starts depending on how involved we got on, international issues and so forth. But, we do have a combined military service.
Right. Well, part of that military service, I think, too, is, I think I'm probably going to use the word the wrong way, but it's a simulative.
Mm-hmm.
The thing that people do not understand about the U.S. military and really take for granted in this country is that anyone, and Republicans have tried to peel this back, but anyone, it used to be like anyone could join the U.S. military, even if you weren't a citizen. You would be able to join the U.S. military if you were an illegal immigrant and actually get your citizenhood that way by actually going and fighting for this country that you scrambled to get to from the place that you were coming from. The U.S. military brings a level of civilian assimilation that is incredibly important in terms of maintaining actual societal cohesion. I'm a big fan of the U.S. military just for the fact that it takes a lot of people and instills good things like discipline and work ethic into them. And it also one thing that I've always really respected about the veteran community is that those veterans really do look out for each other, and even if they don't like each other, they have a level of respect that they will, offer a helping hand even to someone they don't like. There is something very special about our veterans here in the U.S., and I think part of that is they are assimilated into a culture that in turn releases them back into general society here in the U.S., where they become positive, benefiting members of our society. And I think having an institution like that, where people can enter a service, because one thing about the military, and there's many, many things to criticize about it, but not everything that they do is centered around war. There's a lot of civilian and civil services that the military provides, like the Army Corps of Engineers. They do a lot of stuff with water and water infrastructure all over the country. there are a lot of good things that the military is able to influence in terms of our cultural cohesion, and the Europeans really don't have anything like that. Like, if you're a Serb, you can't go join a service where you're going to be working alongside a Brit or an Italian or something like that, where you're going to have to put aside your cultural differences and maybe your cultural discriminations and work together as a unit. Where here in the U.S. you can have a Mexican from New York, a gay German from San Francisco. You can have a Spanish school teacher from St. Louis, Missouri, and then some 18-year-old hotshot from Miami, Florida. And all these people can be vastly different from each other, but they're going to have to learn to work together within that service.
Right.
And they're going to have to, and, part of putting their cultural differences aside is going to be taking up new cultural similarities to each other. Like I said, Europe has none of that. And I actually think that is playing a big part into why they're so separate to each other. They have what I'm basically saying that the military has allowed is that they've created a mechanism that people are able to come together, meet each other, and go back to their communities and say, like, hey, I worked with this person who's a Mexican, and I might come from this white community where people feel this way about Mexicans, but I worked with a bunch of Mexicans while I was in the military, and they're good people to work with, and they'll tell that to their neighbors and friends.
I would hope that happens more frequently, as you say. Yeah.
Well, I've seen it a lot in terms of how veterans talk to each other, where, if you're a Serb, you're not going to really have the...
Right.
Like, for example, let's take this. If you're a Serb, you're not going to have the opportunity, most likely, to fight side by side with a Croatian for a common goal, because, Serbs and Croatians are enemies. There's no mechanism bringing them together for a common purpose. And I think that is an interesting observation of, but what happens before and after World War III on Earth? So one thing that the Ficus sector is facing is that there's a solar flare heading for the fifth planet where the Bringloidi are. And Riker has to beam down and assess the situation, of course, to make the agreement that they're going to bring all the Bringloidi up, including their cows and their stills. One person that we meet immediately, two people that we meet immediately is Daniela Odell, who is the leader of the Mariposians, and his daughter, Brenna Odell, who's the real leader of the Mariposians. Daniela Odell is trying to marry his daughter off, and this actually is a very key point of the episode. I want to make some observations about Brenna. That costume could not have been more sexualized if they tried. They clearly dressed her up in a way for her to be picked up by William Riker, who, as you notice, is quite smitten with her, and she's quite smitten with him. It's actually one of the one weak thing about this episode that I don't like, and I like this episode a lot. Riker and Brenna get together in Riker's quarters. They obviously sleep together. But after that, there's literally no conversation about it whatsoever. We don't have a goodbye. We don't say, we don't have a, well, this is how thing works out, kid. We don't have any of that. The episode really just throws Riker and Brenna together, but Daniello is an interesting character. He plays kind of a prototypical Irish scoundrel, the lovable daddy-o that, is trying to get off to mischief somewhere, but his daughter's the one who keeps him alive. Of course, Brenna's this beautiful firebrand. What do you think of the Mariposians, and what do you think of these two characters?
I think they're just fun. I think it's a good, father who's the leader because he's male and he's older, versus the as you say, the fiery daughter has a good head on her shoulders and knows that her father is sort of bumbling and he likes to get around and start drinking their whiskey from their stills and tell stories and so forth rather than getting the job done. But Brenna's the person who says, this needs to happen, that needs to happen for this merry band of wanderers to survive.
It's very interesting that even centuries later, after they've left Earth and they've wandered the stars and they ended up on this planet, they still have kind of this patriarchal structure in a little bit.
Yeah.
I found that very interesting. It's good that you brought up, like, this kind of, he is this patriarch in a way, but she really is the driving force behind it. So they bring the Neo-Transcendentalists up on the ship, and of course Danielle is trying to marry off Brenna, and I think he probably would have succeeded in Riker if he doesn't warn Picard about the other colony, which was half a light year away, and I need to look up the name of the other ship.
Yeah, it remind me of that. The way they find out about the other colony is from Danilo, right? He mentions it, right?
Well, like, he is setting up things for Picard because Picard tells him that they're going to drop him off at a star base, and Danielle asks, "Well, have you heard from the other colony?"
Right, that's right. I remember now.
So there's the Mariposa. So I'm guessing that it is. So I don't think they give a name to the actual ship, but apparently there were two ships, and one went from. One landed on one planet, and one went half a light year away to another M-class world.
Yeah, I think the smaller group is the Mariposa, isn't it?
Yeah, I think you're right.
Because it's
the Bringloidy.
And it doesn't explain how they split up, because it, like, when they looked at the manifest, it had all this agrarian farm equipment plus a lot of computers and things like that, and obviously the small colony that had the gene burnout problem, there's a different name for it, look at the notes.
Oh, yeah.
That they took all of the technology with them, along with probably food replicators and etc.
Yeah.
If they had them at that time, and the Bringloidy just were their kind of Irish agrarian people.
Mm-hmm. Well, the Mariposians set up this society that's based off cloning, because they have apparently this high level of sophisticated technology that they were able to bring with them. But before we get to that, one interesting thing is, and we mentioned it earlier, Picard laughs because he is in the cargo bay, and he says that he has to bow to the absurd of it. I find this a fun scene because it's great to see Patrick Stewart laughing, and it's a change in the character. Do you think that Picard is... do you think Picard likes meeting different cultures face to face? Or do you think that he just wants to stay at the bridge most of the time?
I think he's interested in meeting other cultures.
Yeah.
And, the fact that he's so diplomatic, I think if you're a diplomat, you tend to, even if you feel not favorable toward a certain different species and so forth, it's part of your job, and you wouldn't have that job unless you had curiosity about dealing with others.
Right. He just really doesn't like Daniello. But a lot of people don't seem to like Danielle. Another fun exchange with Danielle before we pass on to the Mariposians. There's an interesting exchange that he has with Worf where Worf reveals that the replicator can make synthahol drinks.
Right.
But O'Brien and Odell had already apparently had a previous get-together, and Odell didn't like the synthahol. So Worf is able to actually go to the replicator and program it to produce a Klingon liquor that's actual liquor, not synthahol.
Right.
I found this to actually be a very interesting moment. The way that we've been taught that the replicators work is that they resequence protein molecules. But if you're actually able to create kind of an alcoholic drink that is synthahol, which has, none of the deleterious effects, but all of, quote-unquote, the pleasurable effects, which I have to probably assume it's the sedative effects of alcohol. Um, I just find it interesting that Worf is able to suddenly conjure this. For
Well, that's a good point because we've been describing the food synthesizers as basically protein synthesizers, which, since they don't have access to a ranch or a chicken farm, a chicken house, or turkeys, all of their proteinaceous material they're going to have to manufacture. But it seems like the synthesizers can, if they can cook entire meals, that they can do, starches and complex carbohydrates and
right.
vegetable material and fruit material with all the proper sugars and that sort of thing. And, they should be sophisticated enough, you would hope, that they could make sure that there's a proper amount of vitamins and minerals in the diet also.
Do you think it's a good thing that you can actually program a replicator to produce real alcohol like that?
Well, I always thought that there was that's a good point too, because whenever you're on 10 forward, they're always serving synthahol.
Right.
The only time you get alcohol is if Guinan or somebody pulls it off the shelf and back.
Right.
So, yeah, that's a good question for the writers. Is like, what did you really intend? Do you want to be able to take like a safety off the food replicator so they can produce a truly alcoholic beverage, or do you only have alcohol on the ship when it's brought in as a case of Jack Daniels or Gordon's Gin,
right,
or the green stuff that Scotty always ends up drinking to put the other alien under the table?
Right. God bless Scotty and that green stuff. One thing that I'm always curious about, you bring up a really good point. Do they bring it on? We don't see a lot of characters suffering things like alcoholism or other forms of addiction.
No.
So part of me thinks that one of the reasons for that is that they came up with this synthahol alternative,
Right.
and that synthahol alternative has just become the norm to drink. Like people, you drink a quote-unquote scotch at the end of the day, but it's a synthahol scotch. It's not the actual real stuff. Yet, there's clearly this culture in 10 Forward where there's people drinking real alcohol. So people are wanting to drink real alcohol. And even later on, Picard's going to go home. His family's running a vineyard. They're making real wine. It's not synthahol wine.
Yeah, right, yeah.
And even Robert makes a lot of jides toward Picard about, this isn't the synthahol stuff that you drink.
Right.
I think that on one hand, not being able to produce alcohol from the replicator probably means you could replicate a lot of other things too. Dad, for those of you at home, recently started watching Voyager, and we watched the episode recently where Chakotay shows Janeway his device that allows her to have a psychedelic experience without having to use drugs. And that basically, and he even says, our scientists generations ago figured out how to create this device that gives us this journey without having to take things like mushrooms or cannabis or a whole host of pharmacological substances. It makes me wonder if the culture of the future, they don't have any sort of cultural hang-ups against things like psychedelic journeys or trips, because they're clearly making these devices that people like Chakotay can have. So the idea of maybe taking a spiritual journey is not in the future is not looked at as something you have to stop people or legislate against. You can actually sell them a device to do it. Same thing with you don't actually have to worry about people getting drunk. You can just give them synthahol. But maybe in the future there is a sense of individuals are responsible enough that we can give them the option of these things, and we don't have to worry about them Brenda's probably right. There's a worry about Daniela O'Dell sitting around the replicator all day replicating Klingon liquor, but maybe in the future there's no worry about that because people have just ordered themselves differently.
Right. Sure. Yeah.
So when we go to we go to Mariposa, the other M-class world where the second crew was, we discovered that there was a hull fracture upon, the ship crashed and there was a hull fracture that exposed most of the crew to radiation and killed everyone except 5 individuals. And using their scientific know-how and the technology available to them, they essentially started cloning these 5 people to create a civilization or society on Mariposa. But when they arrive, first of all, there's 5 very unique individuals, and I have to say, for casting, they had to have done a really just thorough casting. They had to have called every twin in L.A. Or every triplet. They probably put out a huge casting call. I have to say, I was very impressed, especially with that one scene where there are those 3 brunette women standing next to each other, and just finding triplets like that had to have been a really hard thing production-wise.
Right.
But it turns out, as they talked to Prime Minister Granger, that the clones are starting to... 2 things have happened in the cloning process. Basically, the clones have become infertile, which is not true, it turns out. Just turns out that they can't inseminate or reproduce with each other. The clones can't reproduce with each other. And that they are now suffering from replicative fading, where each generation of clones is starting to suffer genetic anomalies, genetic diseases, stuff that happens during the cloning process, which is actually scientifically founded. There's a real worry that if let's say we took a cell from Jake and decided that we were going to clone 10 Jakes, and then we took a cell from each of those 10 Jakes and decided that we were going to clone 10 more Jakes from each of them, you can all see that this is getting exponential. Scientifically speaking, at some point in a generation of cloning Jake, there would be a problem where the cell would have been cloned so many times that it would have probably broken down from its original form, and you don't actually have a really good cell to clone people from. It's broken down so much that these clones come out, possibly mentally or physically deformed.
It's more like the original genetic sequence is not staying true.
Exactly.
Mutations are showing up.
Well, that's it exactly. Like, the more cloning, the more a mutation at some point shows up and destabilizes everything. Which says something interesting about how they view cloning in sci-fi. There really is this kind of idea that you have to have some sort of genetic purity in cloning to make it work. Why do you think that is? And I know you have a biology background, but you may not have read a lot about cloning, and I have to admit as well, folks, that I don't know a lot about cloning from a scientific basis. But I'd have to imagine that you would have to have a pretty clean sample and keep that sample fairly clean.
I think you just basically don't know a whole lot about that, but I think you just want, basically have, just like you go to a horse show and you look for a really good breeding mare or a breeding sire and so forth. And it's what you want to have is, a genome that's healthy.
Right.
I think that's really the main thing.
Well, at some point, one question that we have to ask is that from these 5 survivors, were these the healthiest people to survive?
Don't know the reason for that, because it could be that they had less exposure to radiation for some reason than the others.
Well,
they could have had a genetic advantage in some way, that they could get sick but survive it still.
Well, one question I have is that along the process, if they try to... I have to imagine that they were smart enough to account for replicative fading. They weren't genetically engineering themselves along the way. I'm kind of surprised that they got to this point by not
that's not mentioned at all, correct.
Well, I think that the immediate solution to this, besides adding quote-unquote fresh breeding stock to the local populace, is that you would actually genetically engineer... And this is going to sound crazy. And we talked about this in a previous episode, an incident in China a few years ago where a Chinese geneticist genetically altered 2 small babies to make them essentially immune to the HIV virus, which, while a huge breakthrough, is morally and ethically condemnable and something he should not have done because it harmed those children.
Right.
One thing that one thing that came out of that incident for me that I didn't consider beforehand, we've always talked about, even in modern day sciences, we've talked about how the future of childbirth may actually feature children being born outside of the womb, because the actual biological risk to the mother may necessitate us using technology to change that.
Mm-hmm.
One thing that I've always kind of thought about is, there really is this industry here in America for surrogacy, where you can get a woman to take on a man's, basically take on a fertilized zygote into
Right.
her uterus and
Right.
basically grow the baby in her womb, where it's not her baby genetically.
Correct.
It's the genetic donor, it's the donor parents.
Mm-hmm.
But what if you did the same thing where, like, in the cloning tank, you change it enough to where it may be your genes that you're putting in there, but the genes of the person coming out, it's not the same person coming out anymore.
Oh, yeah, sure.
And I
Yeah.
think, wouldn't that help you, get away from the replicative fading? Because it seems the way they're defining
Yeah.
replicative fading here is that, it's not just there's been one Prime Minister Granger, there's been 20 Prime Minister
Yeah,
Grangers.
well, I think you're saying is that they didn't do any, they as sophisticated as their technology is in cloning, they didn't have CRISPR-Cas9, so they couldn't go in and identify those genes that were going to cause disease, that
Right.
were defective, so they could, surgically remove them and replacing them with more desirable or more functional genes.
Well,
They weren't doing that.
This might say something about the actual episode when it's being debuted in 1989, that maybe they had no idea of CRISPR back then.
No, there was no idea of CRISPR back then.
So
No.
So I have to wonder, what this episode would look like if this episode could even be written today with the advent of CRISPR.
No, it'd have to be totally different, because genetic technology, 1989 compared to, what's that, 32 years later?
Yeah.
32 years later, just leaps and bounds.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, the way they finally so the first thing the Mariposians tried to do is they tried to ask the crew of the Enterprise to donate their genetic material so they can clone new members of their society to deal with this replicative fading process. And there's a very interesting debate that takes place in the observation room between Prime Minister Granger and the crew, which is Riker.
The senior staff, basically.
Well, it's not all of them. It's
Yeah.
Riker, it's Picard, there's Pulaski there, and I think was Geordi there?
Geordi was there.
Yeah, Data wasn't there.
No, I don't think so.
But, basically Granger says, we would like you to submit genetic material, and Riker's the first one to say, no. One William Riker in the universe, that he's unique, but, 5, 10, suddenly I don't know, whether I lose my uniqueness, and Pulaski's, the same way. And she feels the exact same way, and they basically say flat out no. And then Granger turns around and says, but we have a right to live, we have a right to survive, and without this DNA, our society falls apart. I have to ask you, where do you fall in terms of this argument? Because what Granger ultimately does, and what his society ultimately tries to do, is they end up kidnapping Pulaski and Riker, and taking and Geordi, and taking their DNA, and they are actually in the process of cloning them when Riker and Pulaski and Geordi find out, beam down to the surface, and then kill the clones. But what do you think of this argument of the right to decide what to do with your body medically versus the right to survive?
It's a really good presentation of the ethical question, because it's the position that the Enterprise crew is taking, specifically as represented by Riker and Dr. Pulaski, is you cannot take my genetic material or my cells, because they're actually taking, they took epidermal cells, which contains DNA, without my consent.
Right.
So that personal consent over an individual's biological property is saying that that takes precedence over somebody making a demand on an individual to make a coerced donation of genetic material, even if it's to basically save a population.
Do you think that there's an argument that that population could make, though? Like, I have the right to live, and if I don't do this, I'm not going to survive, or my children won't survive, or my society won't survive.
It's a tough question to answer, because if you put it in the context of how cloning technology, genetic technology was in this episode, you'd have to say, no, you'd have to respect the right of the individual. However,
Right.
now it's like, well, is the technology advanced enough? And yes, we agree that there's the ethical consideration that somebody would not give consent, for their DNA to be used, because the technology is much more facile, is much more, could really address these problems that these people had.
And, as we just mentioned a few minutes ago, if this episode was written today,
Right.
I think that they would have a very different conversation.
They'd have to, yes.
Well, I think it would be I think Granger would come forward and be like, we need fresh DNA. We will take it, we will change it. It will not be you who comes out of here, but, we need DNA that we can take and manipulate. Do you think that Riker and Pulaski would have a different reaction if it was presented to them that way?
I think how the problem was presented, along with
The action.
possible ethical solutions, would have made a difference, yes.
Yeah. Do you think it is ethical to take someone's DNA and alter it, and then create life from it?
Without their consent.
No, with their consent.
Oh, I'd have to rethink through that, just think through the scenarios. I
Right.
can't give you a quick answer to
Well,
it.
I think the crux of what I'm getting at here is that when it really comes to this, we're talking about playing God in a way that I don't think we've ever
Well-
really predicted playing God.
Well, here's an answer to it. I mean, there's attempts to get woolly mammoth DNA
Right.
out of frozen samples out of the Siberian permafrost, and I think there's a project recently to bring back oryx, which were
Yes.
an oxid in Europe, and I don't think those experiments are going well.
No.
But there's going to be continued research of this type where you find the genome of a species that existed 10 to 40,000 years ago. And if there's enough of the genome, scientists are going to bring that animal back from extinction,
Right.
basically.
Well, I think, we talked about global warming, and I have to say, and if I didn't mention it beforehand, I think you're absolutely right about the risks that we're facing and the human responsibility that is needed to address and deal with these risks. I think one thing that we are going to have to do in the future to really restabilize the environment, I think cloning is going to be very important in terms of reintroducing native wildlife that we have wiped out from certain biomes in certain environments. We are going to have to clone them, breed them, and reintroduce them into the wild.
Interesting point.
And I just think that that's the natural thing we're going to do, especially the oceans. I think that we are going to have to find a way to artificially repopulate the plankton if we are able to de-acidify and cool down the temperature that within the actual oceans themselves. Because the current problem is the rise in temperatures causing greater acidification, and that acidification is
Well, the CO2, more CO2
Yes.
dissolved in the seawater, right.
and that acidification is wiping out just
Yeah.
billions and untold. I say billions, but we really don't know
The
the
main
number.
concern is coral reefs, but then, as you say, that's
Right.
part of the food chain. So what effects up the food chain is it having then?
Right. I think that if you have... I think, getting to the question of whether the Mariposians have an ethical argument, I do think that they have an argument in terms of the right to survive. I don't think that they are wrong in saying that, we need to do something because we are the last possible instance. Kidnapping is wrong. Taking the DNA without consent is clearly wrong. But I do think that they are ultimately right in their argument. They do have a right to survive. The question is, like, what limits do you have in terms of acting out that desire to survive? Like, how far do you go to survive? Because the argument could be, like, Picard could be like, well, we could take you off this planet, too, because you were lost. And we can take you all back to the Federation. We can reintegrate all these clones into society. And you guys wouldn't even have to worry about a new...
Well, that's a good point, is that there were so few people on this planet.
Right.
They could evacuate them off, reintegrate them into Terran society, even if it was a star base or in a colony or somewhere. And then by figuring out that you're going to have to sexually reproduce, so you're going to have to use the tools given to you, whether it's male or female, so that they would, they would get the current people would probably, die whenever they were scheduled to die. But in terms of their genome, if they crossbred with people that, had flourishing, healthy genomes, then that would be one way to solve the ethical way to solve the problem.
You just mentioned that. I just thought about that. Like, why didn't the Mariposians offer, like, let's take your DNA and we'll cross it with ours and we're just going to breed new babies? Well, instead of, like, making a new William Riker, a new Pulaski, we'll make the baby of, like,
that's
the
what
brunette one and
that's
Riker.
Ultimately what happened, which, brings the story to a close, where they come up with a somewhat Solomaic
shotgun wedding.
Shotgun wedding, Solomaic
shotgun
wedding.
So, if I may.
Yeah.
So, the ultimate resolution is that the Mariposians need new breeding stock, and Riker, Pulaski, and Picard figure out that they can introduce the Bringloidi as a new breeding stock for the Mariposians. The problem is the Mariposians, and, I wanted to talk about this for a moment because I think it's kind of bullshit in a way, and it's bad writing, but it may also be a reflection of kind of Gene's sexual ideas. So they have become so dependent on technology, the idea of sex for them, for reproduction, has become somewhat disgusting to them.
Right.
But does that mean at some point they lost the idea of sex for, like, recreation or sex for, like, enjoyment or pleasure? Like, have they lost the entire drive to have physical pleasure? Like, how does that work? It's socially, I understand it that once you take off the need to breed, but, like, it just seems it reduces sex down to this very kind of functionary thing in their society where everything else is very puritanical in a way.
The episode, does bring that up.
Where the Bringloidi are clearly having babies.
Yeah, I mean, the Mariposans, it doesn't seem like they have a moral objection to sex. They've just, outgrown it because they depended on cloning. But, your question is, do they have as being humans, do they still have a sex drive? And then they're saying, well, we don't have anything. It's bred out of us. Yeah, that might be something to really question as, again, one of those things where the writers wrote it that way because it makes the story work.
Well, it's like, and this is probably a stupid way of asking it, but if you take a chimp out of the jungle and you put it in an apartment, it's still a chimp, right?
Yeah.
Like, if you take humans and... Like, they're still humans at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And our drive to procreate is a main biological function. Like, I understand to a certain extent, like, maybe from a social standard, but from an actual functional standard of not having sex anymore for any reason whatsoever. Even the Vulcans every 7 years have pon farr.
Right.
And, they look at sex as a little bit abhorrent because there's such emotional attachment to it.
Right.
It just, the world building doesn't seem very good here.
Right, yeah.
The interesting thing, though, they finally get the Mariposians and the Bringloidi to agree to cohabitate on their planet together. and have these, even though there is some social bigotry, which
Yes.
I think shows a distinction between rural versus urban, and I don't want to say academic, but maybe academic versus
Oh yeah, it's very much an urban rural society clash.
right.
Yeah.
But they ultimately solve it and decide to intermarry. But Pulaski suggests to all of them that they have non-monogamous marriages where the wives would have to have at least a child by 3 different husbands.
Right.
And they're going to have to, there's just not going to be a monogamy, even to the point where Daniela Odell makes the joke of, oh, well, I get to have 3 wives. Well, send in the clones, because,
Yes,
we're
right.
good. What do you think of this solution, and do you think that this society ultimately works out with this non-monogamous arrangement? Because honestly, I don't necessarily see them going back to a monogamous state if this is the society that they're going to build on the idea like this is how we rear children. Because in other human societies, especially like down in the Central American, South American Amazon, many of those tribes feature non-monogamous marriages.
But you also had the children were raised by the parents, but also there was greater dependence on the group,
Right.
the community also.
Exactly.
So I think that you bring up a good point when they would do that. Yeah, they probably would. That combined, those 2 combined peoples on one colony, if they, the rules were, okay, we're not going to have monogamous relationships because we need to diversify and broaden the gene pool, then yeah, that's probably how things would say, and it would be very interesting because it would have, issues related to how they govern themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Are they going to be paternalistic? Are there going to be some equality between the sexes? Are the women going to actually have the upper hand?
Yeah, I was about to say there could be a
How do you-
matriarchy formed from this.
How do you not just form a government, but how do you form a social a social system with, economics and particularly healthcare and things like that, care for the elderly and so forth. If they use the concept of money or currency, value of some kind, it's gonna affect all aspects of how they live, how their culture and society evolves.
Absolutely. One thing that, as you were speaking about this, that it just popped in my mind, and I wanted to ask you this because I find this a very interesting question. You're part of a monogamous marriage that's been very successful. I'm part of a monogamous marriage that's very successful. Non-monogamous marriage in this episode becomes a non-ethical issue. Do you think monogamy in itself is an issue of ethics? I know that's a very kind of
I think because it's cultural norm, it becomes ethical, but when you really peel it away, it might be more economic.
right.
Because, right now, I mean, you can look at it, we're in monogamous relationships, and the number of children a couple will have, whether they're male and female or the same sex, is to a large extent, not always, but to a large extent dependent on the economic resources of those parents.
Absolutely.
And, and then you'd have your whole family and its financial foundation may be very differently than if you allowed a husband to have 2 wives or 3 wives. Would the husband, the male, if he's the main breadwinner, how would he have to be compensated? How could he raise enough money to support 2 to 3 wives and all the children? Or would it be something like now where the economic base of the family unit would be much more expanded because not only the father would work, but both of the wives would work, or all 3 of the wives would work, or
Yeah. Well, it's interesting to bring up that because as I mentioned previously, I'm working on this urban fantasy series that, uses a lot of biblical influences, and I've had to read the Bible a lot. Ancient Jewish culture and the Hebrews practiced non-monogamy, especially from a patriarchal standpoint, where men were able to marry multiple wives and bear children through them. But back then, there was like you said, an actual economic need for it based on two things. First of all, childbirth rates. Children actually
surviving was low.
Was very low, and women actually surviving childbirth was
right.
incredibly low back then.
Right.
Now, I don't, even though I think how we treat women in terms of gynecological and obstetrics is still very much, still leaves a lot to be desired, I think, in terms of how it's focused. The risk that women face in 2021 versus a woman in the Bronze Age having a baby, two completely different worlds.
Sure.
So having multiple wives from an economic perspective probably made sense to the ancient Hebrew man in ancient Judea, because he's like, okay, here's wife one. She's given me 2 kids, but if she dies, I have wife number 2, who's also given me at least 1 kid, so I can at least get more kids out of her, and she'll be able to at least take care of these 2 kids from wife number 1, and then if wife number 3 comes along, I can have kids with her, and I can have this entire family, and most of these children, if they survive, usually end up working in the father's craft.
Mm-hmm.
So, Jesus ended up being a carpenter because his father Joseph was a carpenter.
Sure, right.
If Joseph had been a farmer or a fishnet repairer, Jesus would have been repairing fishnets, or would have been a farmer or a blacksmith, depending on what his parents were doing. So the economic benefit for Hebrew men by having multiple wives was not only having the chance to keep your genetic line going, but also have kind of a workforce to keep your entire economic.
Sure.
And it really was a family system
Right.
where everyone would have to
Right.
be involved.
Yeah.
And, there's actual temple law about marrying multiple women, and, a big part of this economically that we're not mentioning, and I do want to mention it because it's so different from what people expect even in 21, there's a dowry system in most of the ancient world, even up into the 1800s, that you and I have no clue about.
Mm-hmm.
If we were doing this in, let's say we were doing this in 846 AD, and we were in the middle of England, and let's say I wanted to marry your daughter. Let's say I'm not your son, and I wanted to marry your daughter, and you were a well-to-do lord, and let's say I'm a up-and-coming duke. You would name a dowry price for your daughter. Now, the prospective suitors, not only would we have to try to meet your dowry price, but we would have to try to compete with your daughter by trying to add to that dowry on top of it. So you would literally buy women by paying the father, it's not just like, here's 500 cows. Here's 500 cows and a battalion of men, or here's 500 cows and a castle. Or stuff like that. The dowry system really did play a huge economic impact in terms of the formation of families, which, I didn't have to pay my father-in-law $5,000 to marry Margot,
Mm-hmm.
and he didn't have to pay me any money to marry her.
Mm-hmm.
If we were talking about this 500 years ago, me and him would have had some sort of economic exchange.
Mm-hmm.
People just have no clue about the kind of world that we lived in just 200 years ago when it came to marriage. It's a very, very different thing. And I think when it comes to, monogamy, I think you're right. At some point it does become an ethical issue, but I think it becomes an ethical issue within the culture that it's centered in. I think if you don't have... What the Bringloian Mariposians are going to have is a culture that doesn't value monogamy. So if it doesn't value monogamy, is it even an ethical issue that all these people are non-monogamous?
Right. Exactly.
So now that we have dealt with that, the Enterprise goes off because, they've saved a day, and we're at the end of the episode. But one last thing. Geordi at one point looks at Prime Minister Granger when they ask, are all the samples of our stolen DNA gone? And Granger says, yes, all the samples of the stolen DNA are gone. And Geordi looks at him and is like, yeah, he's telling the truth. My visor has this thing where I can essentially look at someone and from their electromagnetic responses, their pulse, all sorts of things, their eye movement. I can tell if they're telling the truth. So, Geordi essentially says that he can detect lies in humans. Well, what do you make of that?
Well, it makes it's
It makes sense.
It kind of
makes
makes sense, but is it going to show up anywhere else? I can't remember it showing up anywhere else.
Like, why is Deanna there? Like, isn't she there to detect the lies in the people?
Yeah, exactly.
Like that.
It just pops up, but
It brings to the question of, like, we had the conversation in A Measure of the Man, when Data asked Picard, like, Geordi's eyes are clearly better than human eyes. Why aren't you all getting your eyes replaced with visors? If you could get a visor and you could literally tell if someone's telling the truth, is that better than having this Betazoid who uses her telepathic abilities to tell if someone's having the truth? Like, which one would be better suited for...
You have RoboCops that are just interrogators and RoboCops that are kick-ass gunslingers.
That's Blade Runner.
Okay, there
That
you
is
go.
Blade Runner.
That's Blade Runner.
But on that note, I think this is a fun episode.
Fun, yes.
I think it's a good one. Do you have anything that you want to add before we go?
No, I think we covered it pretty well.
Okay, well, everyone, thank you so much for joining us. We will be back next time for episode 19. I don't have the list with me right here, but we'll be back soon for it. Thank you, Dad, for joining me tonight.
Thank you, Jay. Good night, everybody.
Night. Perfect.
We'll just leave